Welcome to a new video series on social psychology. In this first unit, we will learn about common biases in attribution. Social psychology is a broad discipline. Psychologists may be interested in answering different questions. For example, how do we interact with others? And how might we affect other people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors? In addition, psychologists may be interested in understanding how can we resolve interpersonal conflicts. So these are just some of the questions that psychologists may wish to investigate. Social psychology can be broadly divided into two different topics, the intrapersonal and the interpersonal. Intrapersonal topics are those that pertain to the individual. For instance, self-representation are the ways in which we present ourselves. And social psychologists are interested in understanding whether our presentation changes when we are in front of others. And for cognitive dissonance, it is a mental conflict that occurs when your beliefs don't line up with your own actions. For example, if you want to eat a donut while you are wanting to reduce calorie intake, this would be an example of cognitive dissonance. And for interpersonal topics are those that pertain to groups. For instance, prejudice are beliefs, thoughts, and feelings and attitudes one holds about a group. And discriminations are actions that are made against a group. Now, we will talk about situational and dispositional influences on behavior. Social psychologists tend to take the situationist or environment perspective, whereas personality psychologists have promoted the dispositionist perspective. So social psychologists think that our behavior is determined by environment and surroundings, like culture, social roles, and presence of others. And for personality psychologists, our behavior is determined by internal factors like personality traits and temperament. Modern approaches to social psychology take both the situation and the individual into account when studying human behavior. In fact, the field of social personality psychology has emerged to study the complex interaction of internal and situational factors that may affect human behavior. Social psychologists have identified a phenomenon that people tend to assume the behavior of another person is a trait of that person, and fail to recognize when a person's behavior was in fact due to situational variables. Let's see this example here. Mrs. Lee yells at her daughter. So people may say that Mrs. Lee is a mean and bad-tempered person, so she has the bad-tempered trait. However, using a situational explanation, it was because her daughter interrupts her meeting by making loud noises. So she was in a bad mood. So the mood here was a state, rather than Mrs. Lee having a bad-tempered trait. There are cultural differences in attribution. Research suggests that not all people across cultures commit the fundamental attribution error. In individualistic culture, they focus on individual achievement and autonomy. They have greater tendency to commit the fundamental attribution error. So a person's disposition is thought to be the primary explanation for their behavior. In contrast, in collectivistic culture, they focus more on mutual relationships with others, including family, friends, and the community. They eat together more often and focus on the group more than the individual, which account for situational and cultural influences on one's behavior. Therefore, they are less likely to make fundamental attribution error. Here is a table that illustrates the differences between individualistic culture and collectivistic culture. So you can see from the table that individualistic culture takes on the dispositional view, while situational view is more prevalent in collectivistic cultures. Using our previous example on Mrs. Lee, when an observer attributes her hostile behavior to her disposition rather than to be the situational cause, we call it actor-observer bias. Why does it occur? One reason is that we often lack information when trying to explain other people's behavior, and we rely on what was observable at that given moment. However, when we are trying to explain our own behavior, we do have much more information, so we are less likely to have this bias. Social psychologists found that we tend to see ourselves in a favorable light. Why do you think is the case? So one reason could be that we want to protect our self-esteem. If people always make situational attribution, they would never be able to take credit and feel good about their accomplishments. So for example, if you did well on the midterm, you would think that it is because you are smart and you worked hard. If you didn't do well, you may think that it's because the teacher made the exam too hard. So here are some different biases when you are trying to explain your own behavior. One model proposes three main dimensions of attribution. It is what causes the outcome. So the three dimensions are locus of control, stability, and also controllability. Locus of control refers to dispositional or situational factors. And for stability, it is whether circumstances are likely to change or not. And finally, controllability is whether we have power to control the outcome or not. Here is an example of attribution in tennis player Roger Federer. Research shows that we make dispositional, stable, and controllable attributions when he wins. In contrast, we are more likely to make situational, unstable, and uncontrollable attribution when Federer loses. So you may refer to the example here. While acknowledging that there are different attribution styles across cultures, the just world hypothesis is a worldview that is being valued more in Western cultures. So they believe that good people may experience positive outcomes. In contrast, bad people may experience more negative outcomes. Taking on the situational perspective, there are situational forces like social roles that may affect behaviors. So social roles is a pattern of behavior that is expected of a person in a given context. It is usually culturally shared knowledge and defined by that group of people. So we may have several roles at once. For me, being a teacher, a daughter, and a sister are my different types of social roles. And you may recognize that you may behave differently when you are under different contexts and when you have different social roles to play. In our next video, we will move on to the concepts of conformity and obedience, and I will see you in the next one.